fact, many ways this lecture's goal is to set the record straight on what actually happened in Latin America, both good and bad, and not just with respect to the Spanish, but what we don't hear about is the British oligarchy's underhanded dealings and involvement in both continents. So I want to delve into all those aspects, and in many ways, I could have made this presentation a lot more longer and more detailed, and I would certainly encourage everyone to read further into this. I'm just going to highlight the important points and really go back to before Columbus's discovery in both Europe and America to sort of lay the groundwork and set the record straight on a lot of common misconceptions and legends we've learned as and come to accept as fact over the years. This is unrelated, but I always tell the story of I did not know, how many of you have heard the story that pasta was actually invented in China and Marco Polo brought it back to Europe and that's how it got introduced into Italy? I grew up believing that because that's what I had heard in school. And then I found out only maybe 5 years ago that the whole story about Marco Polo bringing pasta from China was invented in an ad campaign in the 1920s to make pasta seem exotic. And that pasta has actually been in the Mediterranean world since ancient times. So those are and with respect to Columbus and the Spanish conquest and the independence movements, those similar sort of legends are commonplace, and I'm willing to bet a lot of you still believe some of them at least. So I'm going to sort of give some background and try to set the record straight on a lot of these. Before I start, I also want to do two other thank yous. I don't think he's on, but I want to thank Marty Seif, whose comment from a previous lecture actually sparked this idea. And then the other one is kind of a mixed thank you. The Uruguayan author, I think he's deceased now, Eduardo Galeano, wrote a book in the early 70s called The Open Veins of Latin America. Now, at the time, he was a complete communist, and the book is written from that perspective, and he actually later disavowed it. But it was the first source to present me with a lot of facts behind the British involvement and just economic advantage taking of the New World. And, they say a broken clock is right twice a day. If you look past the ideology, you can still find good facts, factual investigation into these in that book. So I would recommend that with a giant asterisk if you want to add it to your reading. So we're going to actually start in ancient Greece, in Alexandria, Egypt. We've all heard the story. People thought the earth was flat, and Columbus thought it was round, and that's how he ended up discovering America. Well, that's completely false. Eratosthenes, who lived around 200 BC, had a brilliant idea based on the sun directly shining into a well in what is now Aswan, Egypt. He figured if you could calculate, if you knew the distance from Aswan to Alexandria and the angle of sunlight in Alexandria on the same day, you could calculate the circumference of the earth. And he actually did it to within between a negative 2.4% and positive 0.8% error, depending on which definition of his stadion you use. So by Columbus's time, they had a good idea of not only that the earth was round, but how big it was as well. And then the Greek geographer Ptolemy, who lived in the 1st century AD, estimated Asia to cover 180 degrees of longitude, when in fact it only covers 150 degrees if you measure it to Japan. That overestimation was Columbus's basis for thinking you could make it from Europe to Asia. However, there was the serious doubts were logistics. Even with Columbus's estimate based on Ptolemy, there were serious doubts that any ship could contain enough provisions for a crew to survive a voyage across what they believed was open ocean to Asia. And that was the difficulty. Why was Columbus willing to take that risk, though? And for that, we'll go back to our friends, the Venetians. In the Mediterranean, starting in the 11th century, there were three major naval powers, all Italian city-states: Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. Pisa declined early because it was politically unstable, and that left Venice and Genoa as the big rivals. Genoa allied with the Eastern Emperor, the Byzantine emperors, while Venice, as we all know from the Fourth Crusade, was against them. And when Venice set up the Latin Empire, Genoa actually supported the rival Greek emperors at Nicaea. And they continued to be allies of the Eastern emperors after the Nicene emperors retook Constantinople. However, Venice, not willing to be outdone, in 1419 concluded a treaty with the Ottoman Sultan that granted it exclusive trading rights. And as we all know, Constantinople fell in 1453 with Genoa defending it. And that left Venice having exclusive trading rights in the Eastern Mediterranean. Genoa's colonies that it still had in the Crimea and in the Black Sea became useless, and Venice could charge whatever it wanted for the luxury goods coming in through the Ottoman Empire from the East. So that the only other naval powers at the time, France and England, had not yet developed their powerful navies. The only two were Portugal and then Aragon, which was united with Castile to form the new Kingdom of Spain in 1492. So a bunch of Genoese navigators, including Columbus, remember he was from Genoa, decided to offer their skills to Portugal and Spain with the goal of cracking the Venetian stranglehold on the monopoly on luxury goods. And for that, the only route that seemed feasible at the time was going around Africa. And Portugal had started that in 1488. The Portuguese navigator Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, showing that there was a sea route open to India. And Columbus actually offered his services to John II of Portugal first, but because the African route proved so promising, John declined. And then, as we know, Vasco da Gama would reach India in 1499, and Portugal would focus its empire building in Asia, in Goa, Ceylon, Macau, the Molucca Islands in Indonesia. And then it also developed an African empire for stops along that route. It baptized and made an alliance with the kings of Congo in what is now Angola, and what's called the Mwene Motapa Empire, and the successor state of the great Zimbabwe. And that became the basis for the Portuguese colonies and later modern nations of Angola and Mozambique. From that detour, Columbus then went to the newly formed Kingdom of Spain and asked for funding for an expedition there to sell them his idea of sailing across the Atlantic. At first, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the monarchs, hemmed and hawed, but after they conquered Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, they found themselves awash in money and gave Columbus three not very good ships, expendable ships, we'll call them, and sent him on what everyone thought was a suicide mission. But let me pull up the screen here. Am I sharing? Okay,
yes, you
great.
are.
Thank you. So the first voyage in 1492, Columbus landed in what are now the Bahamas and traveled to Cuba, Hispaniola. Um, he called the native Arawak-speaking Tainos Indians, or Indios in Spanish, which in English we render Indians. That's the terminology I'll use through most of this. If regardless of sensibilities, I know there's about 5 or 6 terms for the native peoples. I will use what the Spanish did. He had believed he had reached what is actually Indonesia, hence the name. He noted their gold earrings, which is significant for later developments. He founded a settlement with 39 men in what is now Haiti that would be destroyed by the time of his second voyage. And he returned, and news of the discovery surprised everyone, and he secured himself funding for 2 further voyages. The second voyage took him to Cuba, Jamaica, again, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and the Lesser Antilles Islands. And on this one, he brought livestock, seeds, and more settlers. The third voyage was to confirm rumors of the existence of a continent to the south. And on this one, he, as you can see, he skirted the coast of what is now Venezuela, confirming those rumors. And then after he landed in some trouble, which I'll get into later, he went on a 4th voyage and discovered the mainland of the North American continent in Central America. There's also a story that he died believing that he had landed in Asia. There's doubt cast upon that in his own writings. He referred to South America as, quote, a hitherto undiscovered continent. And in other writings toward the end of his life, he referred to the islands as the West Indies. So it's unsure what Columbus actually believed at the time he died. Now, immediately, the Caribbean began to be settled by adventurers seeking the prospect of wealth. The gold earrings that were brought back with the natives to Spain fueled rumors of all sorts of fabulous wealth, and it attracted get-rich-quick schemes. Unfortunately for them, the Caribbean doesn't have very much gold, and the local mines were exhausted. So the settlers turned to cane sugar as the basis for an economy. They enslaved the native population, who later became decimated by disease, later imported African slaves, and then the situation became desperate enough where they started looking to the mainland for other sources of economic gain. In what is now Venezuela, Nueva Cadiz and Cumaná were founded. And then Darien in Panama, it was founded in 1510. And then 3 years later, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed Panama and then reached the Pacific, again confirming that there was another ocean and that this was in fact a new continent. One of these searches for wealth on the mainland would change history. And this was the conquest of Mexico. Unlike the Caribbean, the natives here had an urbanized civilization with standing armies and a cultural tradition that dated back millennia. The first civilization in the area was the Olmecs around 1500 BC. The Teotihuacan civilization followed it, and then the earliest civilization of which oral traditions survive are the Toltecs, based slightly to the north. They were considered the mother culture of the later Aztec Empire. In fact, the word Aztec is a back formation. If you had used it at the time, no one would have recognized it. What it actually refers to is a confederation of 3 Nahuatl-speaking city-states around Lake Texcoco in central Mexico. The main city was Tenochtitlan, who called themselves the Mexica, or Mexica, whence we get the name Mexico. Texcoco, who called themselves the Acolwa, and then Tlacopan, who called themselves the Tepanec. The ruler of Tenochtitlan was paramount, and you can see on the right the artist Diego Rivera's rendition of what Tenochtitlan would have looked like right before the conquest. It was actually built on the lake, on artificial islands called chinampas. And the ruler, the Tlatoani in Nahuatl, often translated as emperor, what was the leader of this confederation. Now, it was a young empire. Tenochtitlan itself was only founded in 1325, less than 200 years before the Spanish conquest. And it received its first ruler as a prince from the city of Culhuacan, which was a successor state of the Toltecs. And so there was that lineage claimed to go back into the 10th century with the Toltec mother culture. The Aztecs were an efficient military machine, and they conquered their empires, you can see, fairly quickly into both mostly central Mexico, but also Guatemala. And they ruled by a campaign of sheer terror. Human sacrifice had been practiced in the region since time immemorial. It'd been a major part of the religions of every previous culture, going back to the Olmecs. But the Aztecs really honed the art to, if you want to call it that, to unprecedented levels. They had practiced sacrifice on an industrial scale and used the demand for captives, for war captives and captives as tribute, as a control mechanism on their subject tribes. For example, at the rededication of the new constructed Templo Mayor, which is the main building you can see in the rendition there, in 1487, 80,400 captives were sacrificed over a period of 4 days. Now, the result of this was that the Aztecs had a lot of neighbors who absolutely hated them. And if they came across someone powerful enough, would have gladly lent their services to them. And that's what actually happened with Hernan Cortes, who was a well-connected Spaniard from the lesser nobility. He had settled in Cuba, and through his connections received authorization to explore the mainland. So in February 1519, he left Cuba. June, he founded Veracruz on the coast, and then began to establish alliances, particularly with the Totonac and Tlaxcalan peoples. And then by November 8th, he had reached Tenochtitlan and met with the emperor. His Nahuatl name was Motecuzoma Xocoyotzin, but in English, it's rendered Montezuma, and I'll just use that version. There was the legend of Seacatl Topiltzin, who was supposedly a bearded ruler, a Toltec ruler from the past, who had established high culture and banned the practice of human sacrifice, and ended up being overthrown by war leaders and had fled east across the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the interesting thing about that is in the Mayan ruins at the time, there's a sudden Toltec influence and style around the 11th, 12th centuries. So there may be some truth to that legend, but as it was, when these strange bearded men appeared from the east, that was what Montezuma immediately began to associate them with. He invited them into his palace, gave them everything they wanted, and honored Cortes as semi-divine. Not everyone was as convinced, however, and the Spanish quickly outwore their welcome. And then while Cortez was absent asking for more funding of the Aztec elites at a religious festival, as a result, the mob surrounded the palace, killed Montezuma, made his half-brother emperor, and then the Spanish had to retreat from the city with heavy losses. Cortez had returned by then, and he regrouped them, and at the Battle of Otumba, which would probably be one of the key battles in history, he defeated the Aztec forces by targeting their leaders, which the native form of warfare and the Spanish form of warfare were very different. The goal of native warfare was to capture the enemy so that you could sacrifice him at your religious ceremony leader. Warfare had a very religious basis to it. The European style of warfare was simply to kill your enemy, and the natives were unprepared for that method of fighting. So when Cortez killed the Aztec leaders, they scattered, and that gave him time to regroup and receive the reinforcements he had requested, and group his Indian allies as well. In the meantime, his biggest ally was invisible. In December of 1520, the smallpox epidemic devastated Tenochtitlan, and Montezuma's successor was one of the victims. They chose another emperor. But the population of the city was drastically reduced. And by May 10th, 1521, when Cortez began to lay siege, the city was already devastated. And on August 13th, 1521, the city fell, and the Spanish acquired an empire that was already built for them. It would form a basis for expanding further out. Going to the south, the conquest of the Maya were slower. The Yucatan and Guatemala were divided into many small city-states with ruling elite families. And the Spanish adopted a divide and conquer strategy where they would build alliances to take advantage of the long-standing feuds that kind of resemble the feuds among the great families in Renaissance Italy or in Germany at the time. And in 1542, one of the most powerful lords converted to Catholicism, and all of Western Yucatan followed him in submitting to Spain. Eastern Yucatan resisted, but by 4 years later, they were pretty much subdued. Interestingly, in the remote areas of Guatemala, the Itzá Maya held out in Lake Petén until 1697. It was the last pagan Indian state in the Americas by the time it fell. To the north, the north of central Mexico was largely desert. Juan de Oñate reached his New Mexico, what he called New Mexico, in 1598. He's known as the last conquistador. Santa Fe was founded in 1610. The missions in Arizona in the late 17th century, and then finally the province of Las Californias was created in 1768. So the colonization northwards was a much slower process. We're talking about 200 years before settlement reached into Northern California. Oh, and I should have gone to that. That's Cortez's route from Veracruz to Tenochtitlan, which was refounded as Mexico City. The other almost fortuitous acquisition was the conquest of Peru. Like Mexico, the Andes had an urbanized civilization stretching back thousands of years. There was the Chavin culture of the first millennium BC, the Moche culture, known for their pottery, which you can see in the top left there, the Nazca culture at about the same time. We're talking about 200 BC to 600 AD, famous for the Nazca lines. And then there was the Tiwanaku culture after the city of Tiwanaku in what is now Bolivia. Its ruins you can see on the bottom left there. It flourished from about 200 BC to 1000 AD. And again, the Incas were successor to this cultural tradition. Oh my. Did I miss a slide? Oh, no. It was a comparatively young empire too, although I'm going to footnote that in most chronicles, they credit the Incas with 13 rulers from their legendary first son of the sun god to the Spanish conquest. But there is an outlier, Fernando de Montesinos, who wrote about 100 years after the conquest. He lists 102 rulers going back to about 400 BC. And until recently, he was kind of dismissed as a crank, and shouldn't be credited. But recent investigation into his sources and archaeological evidence indicates that the chronicle he gives matches up pretty well with the archaeological record, and what it probably could be is a reference to the rulers of Tiwanaku, with the Inca regarding themselves as a successor state of it. So we're potentially looking at a continuous, not just tradition, but line of rulers lasting to the Spanish conquest. But the actual expansion from the Valley of Cuzco, which was the Inca capital, to the empire that the Spanish found only occurred within the last 100 years before the Spanish conquest. And it was largely two rulers, Pachacuti and Tupa Inca, who expanded it from what is now Ecuador into Chile. The Inca warfare was brutal, and the oral traditions talk about battles where there's tens of thousands of casualties. But their ruler was much more mild than the Aztecs. They ruled through centralization. All males ages 15 through 50 were required to contribute labor as tribute. This was called the mita. All agriculture belonged to the state, and it was distributed, to each according to his needs, so to speak. There was an elaborate system of roads and fortresses, which were made out of stone without use of the wheel in the Andes Mountains, which was a formidable and impressive task. Interestingly enough, the elites, the royalty and nobility, had their own separate language that the commons were forbidden from learning. It's suggested that this was a relic of the Tiwanaku language, and the Spanish chronicle Garcilaso de la Vega, whose mother was actually Inca royalty, said that even his mother forgot the language after the Spanish conquest because there was no more use for it. The common people spoke Quechua, which is still spoken by a couple million people in Peru today. And then the emperors were regarded as semi-divine. After they died, they were mummified, and their estates were extremely wealthy with lands and attached servants. So it was a sophisticated culture, far less bloody than the Aztecs were. But it fell largely because of the same mechanisms that led to the Aztec conquest: disease and internal division. In 1527, the empire was at its height. As you can see, it stretched from Colombia to Chile along the entire western coast. The emperor was Huayna Capac, and he was in Quito, which had recently been conquered, when a plague swept through. It's more likely than not that this plague originated with the Spanish settlement in Panama that nobody knew about at the time, but disease spread more than before the people did. And not only did it kill the emperor, it also killed his heir. And that was a problem because under Inca law, the emperor designated his successor. So with both the emperor and the heir gone, that threw the succession up in the air. The nobility in Cuzco backed Huáscar, who was regarded as the legitimate emperor because his mother was Huayna Capac's sister. But he was regarded as soft by the army, who also resented the nobility in Cuzco, and they preferred Huáscar's half-brother Atahualpa, who had accompanied his father in Quito. After 2 years, Atahualpa openly rebelled, and a bloody civil war followed. In a couple of the battles, according to the oral tradition, there were 100,000 casualties. And we're talking about fighting with clubs and slingshots and arrows and things like that. Absolutely brutal. At the end of the war, Huáscar was toppled from his throne, sent to Cuzco, and tortured and killed. And that was in 1531. Atahualpa stayed to consolidate his forces. At that time, however, Francisco Pizarro, who was the illegitimate second cousin once removed of Cortes, and who was actually illiterate until his adulthood, was one of the adventurers who had settled in Panama looking for fortune. He had accompanied Balboa's expedition to the Pacific and was rewarded by being made governor of Panama City. In 1523 and 1526, he had sailed down the Pacific coast of South America, just a reconnaissance expedition. He was received warmly and given gold, silver, and llamas, which, again, the gold and silver fueled tales of fabulous wealth to be gained and attracted many more adventurers. And also he was welcomed because, interestingly enough, there was a Peruvian legend about the bearded creator god Viracocha, who gave the gifts of civilization to the Andean peoples and then fled west across the Pacific. So in a cruel twist of irony, we have the exact same legend in Central America repeated in the opposite that dovetails almost perfectly with the arrival of the Spanish. It's, if you don't believe in fate, events like this almost make you reconsider your position. The governor of Panama refused a third expedition for Pizarro because he was a personal enemy. So Pizarro went to Spain to petition the king himself, the Habsburg Emperor Charles I, who was also Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V, to request permission for a voyage, which he promptly received based on the reports of the wealth to be gained. So on September 24th, 1532, he landed with 200 men and received an invitation from Atahualpa to meet in person. And so they met the emperor with his 5,000 men at Cajamarca, which you can't really see it it's not on the map here. It's in central Peru. And right away, Pizarro confronted him and demanded that he convert to Catholicism and pay tribute to Charles I. Of course, the Inca refused, and the Spanish attacked with cavalry and firearms, which again were completely unfamiliar. And despite being hugely outnumbered, that threw the Inca forces at a loss. And at the end of the day, they captured Atahualpa, who promised to pay a ransom if they would release him, with one room filled with gold as high as the emperor could stretch his hand, and 2 rooms of similar size filled with silver. Well, Pizarro didn't believe him, but when the emperor made good on his promise, it shocked the Spaniards, but they didn't release the emperor. Instead, they put him on trial for the usurpation of the throne and the murder of his brother. And they gave him the option of being baptized or hanged or being burnt at the stake. The emperor was baptized and hanged. And from there, the Spanish entered Cuzco unopposed. And in fact, they had, like with the conquest of Mexico, they had a good deal of support because Huáscar's power base had been in Cuzco, and the enemies of Atahualpa saw this as both sort of a divine revenge and, welcomed the Spanish almost as liberators in some respect. Interestingly, in Peru, the Spanish began to rule through puppet Incas, a series of 3 up till 1549. The second of these, Manco Inca, actually fled Cuzco and set up a rebellious successor state in the jungles at Vilcabamba. And that continued until 1572, when the last ruler, Tupac Amaru, was captured and then taken back to Cuzco and beheaded. And if you hear the name Tupac Amaru, it's frequently used as a name of rebel groups in Latin America. And actually, the rapper Tupac Shakur is named after him. He was sort of considered an icon of the native resistance to Spanish rule. And again, like with the conquest of Mexico, the conquest of Peru left the Spanish in control of an empire that in this case stretched over about half of a continent, and a variety of different peoples and languages, and it gave them a base to expand. Only 5 years after the conquest of Peru, Gonzalo de Quesada led 6 expeditions into what is now, what was called New Granada. It's now called Colombia. And then the forces with Pizarro expanded further south into Chile, securing the entire western coast. In 1528, Charles of Spain, to settle a debt with the Welser and Fugger banking families of Germany, granted them the rights to colonize the Caribbean coast, which they named Kleine Venedig, or Little Venice, which in Spanish is Venezuela. And but Charles revoked their charter in 1545 and put it back under royal control. And then starting in 1535, but permanently in 1580, the Spaniards began to settle in the La Plata River, founding Buenos Aires. And that would form the basis for the Atlantic coast of Spanish colonies. Now, I've talked about Spain thus far. The Incan Empire was called in its Quechua Tawantinsuyu, which means the 4 corners of the world, and it was literally divided into 4 corners, which are the provinces you see here, part of its central organization, and that's Pizarro on the left. So I've talked about Spain thus far. I am going to discuss Portugal and Brazil as sort of footnotes to this, because Brazil is the most populous nation in Latin America, and it should be mentioned. And there's also an interesting history here. The dispute between Spain and Portugal over Atlantic territories actually predates the discovery of the New World. In 1479, to resolve there was a war over the Castilian succession, which ultimately led to Isabella inheriting the Castilian throne. But part of the resolution was the Treaty of Alcáçovas, in which Castile and Aragon agreed to a division of spheres of influence in the Atlantic. Now, Portugal had recently settled Madeira and the Azores, and Spanish colonists had discovered the Canary Islands and were settling them. So there was a purpose to this division. And then in 1481, the Pope Sixtus IV confirmed the division in the treaty. On the return from his first voyage, Columbus, due to bad weather, had to land in Lisbon and met with John II of Portugal, who had earlier refused him money. And John's reaction was immediately to assert that the voyage violated the terms of the treaty. So later that year, the Pope, Alexander VI, the infamous Alexander VI, who was actually an Aragonese by birth and took a great interest in these developments in the Atlantic, issued a couple of bulls, Inter Cetera and Dudum Sequidem, which granted Spain nearly all the newly discovered lands beyond 100 league meridian, which is the dotted purple line in the map here. John II was not happy with that, and he negotiated a separate treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas with Spain, which extended the meridian to 370 leagues, which Alexander VI's successor, Julius II, confirmed in a separate bull. Now, interestingly, the Treaty of Tordesillas is the basis for what in English and later American law is called the Discovery Doctrine. And it's actually been cited as valid legal doctrine, including by the U.S. Supreme Court as recently as 2005. So this is very much, still a relevant occurrence. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, a Portuguese explorer, landed in Brazil, which was within the Portuguese claim. And it's likely that John II knew about Brazil and ordered Cabral to land there, which is why the Portuguese were insistent about pushing the meridian west. And then in 1532, the first Portuguese settlement was established in Brazil. So right away, you had the division of the New World between Spain and Portugal. And then interestingly, a later treaty of Zaragoza in 1529 would establish an eastern bound for the division, which is the green line in the map. So let's talk a little bit now about, I alluded to some of the abuses that the Spanish perpetrated under Columbus and in the early days. And this is what Spain has been unfortunately infamous for. What isn't heard about is the reaction to it and the efforts made to curb the abuses that were going on. And in fact, you can kind of see a theme. The Spanish who settled the New World were, I don't like using the term lower class, but they did come from the lower classes. They were adventurers. They were out to make a buck. They were unscrupulous, and they weren't concerned with human rights. They were concerned with making money and getting out if they could. In Spain, you had a very much different reaction who wanted to build a nation in the New World, build an extension of the Spanish nation in the New World, wanted to treat the natives there as Spanish subjects, just like in Europe, and who wanted to curb the abuses. So what was happening throughout the 16th century was an action and abuses by the colonists, and then a reaction from Spain to tamp down and curb those abuses. And by the mid 16th century, a system was established that actually is some of the earliest developments in what is modern human rights law. And it's an interesting story, and not one I think that's told enough. So I'm going to get started with that. What you see on the left here is actually a Dutch engraving based on accounts of first-hand accounts of Spanish brutality to the natives in the Caribbean on the voyages of Columbus. And the reason the Dutch were keen on engraving this is they were fighting a war with the Spanish, who Charles of Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, had inherited the Netherlands and passed them to his son Philip II of Spain. And the northern part of the Netherlands, which had adopted the Reformation, was fighting a religious war essentially, but also one to free themselves from the Spanish king. And it was a brutal 80-year-long war. And so when the Dutch, as with the English, as we'll see later, got their hands on the accounts of the abuse, which were actually made for the purpose of righting the wrongs, launched a propaganda campaign against the Spanish. But the accounts are largely accurate based on the evidence we have. So starting on his second voyage, Columbus and his men, took the Taino Indians as slaves in the Caribbean. Beatings, torture, rape was a regular occurrence. He shipped 500 captured Taino to Spain as slaves. And he was equally cruel to the Spanish. Hanging and dismemberment were frequent punishments for small infractions. Well, in 1493, the Queen Isabella I revoked Columbus's authority and put the colonies directly under the crown. And she named her chaplain, the Archbishop Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca, in charge of all New World affairs. And he set up a governing council that later in 1524 would become the Consejo de las Indias, or Council of the Indies, that would oversee all New World affairs for the 300 years of Spanish rule. Based on Archbishop Fonseca's investigation, in 1499, Isabella sent Francisco Fernandez de Bobadilla, a nobleman, to investigate, and he actually ended up arresting Columbus and his brothers and bringing them back to Spain for trial. He would later negotiate a release, and that would inform the base. He was allowed to go back for his fourth voyage, but the actual government of the colonies was placed in the hands of the crown. In 1501, Isabella decreed that all natives in the Americas are subject to the Spanish crown, which had an important implication, is that because they were Spanish subjects, they could not be enslaved, except if it was a punishment for certain crimes, certain serious crimes, like cannibalism was one, for example. So with the inability to enslave them, the Spanish colonists established a system called the encomienda. This had actually been established in Spain. It was designed to populate and cultivate the lands that had been reconquered from the Muslim Emirates in Spain. How it worked is the conqueror would receive a grant of land as a fief and was entitled to receive labor as tribute from the subjects. It didn't quite work on the same basis in the New World, because technically the land belonged to the crown and it wasn't the property of the colonists. But the idea of the encomienda enabled the colonists to set up a system that very much resembled slavery without the natives actually being enslaved. And that would become the source of further motivations for reform. In 1504, Isabella died, and actually in her will, she gave the instruction, and I'm going to quote, "Do not give rise to or allow the Indians to receive any wrong in their persons and property, but rather that they be treated well and fairly, and if they have received any wrong, remedy it." That would become the guiding principle in the years following her death. Her widower Ferdinand gave Archbishop Fonseca almost unlimited oversight in New World affairs after her death. In 1510, he sent a group of Dominican friars to Hispaniola to investigate, and they were outraged by what they saw. Well, the colonists were worried by the opposition, and they formed a group, and both sides went to Spain to present their case. Ferdinand of Aragon and his daughter, who was in title Queen of Castile, they sided with the Dominicans, and in response, they passed the laws of Burgos in 1512. Now, these were the first real substantive group of laws to deal with treatment of the Indians. It allowed for the encomienda system to be established, but it imposed significant restrictions on them. And I'll just go through some of them right now. Indians were not allowed to be used as carriers for transporting things. They must be allowed to perform their sacred dances. All citizens who have Indians are required to feed them bread, yams, peppers, and on Sundays cooked meat. For every violation, a fine of 2 gold pesos was to be paid. Sons of the chiefs chiefs who are under the age of 13 were to be instructed how to read, write, and instructed in religion. And they were at 19, they were to return to the encomienda to teach the others. Pregnant women were not to be sent to mines or made to plant. After a child is born, the mother was allowed to nurse it until up to 3 years before she could return to work. Indians were forbidden from sleeping on the ground. The encomendero or owner had to provide hammocks. They were to be given 1 gold peso a year for clothing. And then there was a record keeping and inspection requirements. Villages had to be inspected twice a year. Copies of the laws had to be kept. And then amendments were added a year later. Indian children did not have to do the work of adults until they reached the age of 14. And then after 2 years of service in the encomienda, the Indians were free to leave. The idea was that by this time, and I'm quoting the laws, by this time they will be civilized and proper Christians able to govern themselves. So while this falls far below our own OSHA and child labor laws, for its time, this was a significant step forward, and really is one of the first set of laws establishing what we would call civil rights or human rights or rights to labor. The problem was enforcing them, and they weren't enthusiastically obeyed right away, which brings us to our next subject, Bartolomé de las Casas. He is, unfortunately, I remember learning about him. It was just a name mentioned. He defended Indian rights in Spanish America, but the significance of his work and its lasting impact on human rights law, I think, is unjustly neglected. And much more needs to be done to make people aware of his works and his reputation. I confess, when I was preparing this project, I had not known a lot of the details and the important work he did. So Las Casas was the son of a landowner. He settled in Hispaniola in 1502 and actually himself owned slaves. He returned to Spain in 1506 to complete his studies in canon law. He was ordained a priest in Rome in 1507 and was sent as part of the Dominican delegation to investigate the abuses in 1510. In 1513, he went to Cuba and wrote in his diary, quote, "I saw here cruelty on a scale no living being has ever seen or expects to see." And in the following year, when he was preparing a sermon and came across the following passage from the book of Ecclesiasticus or Sirach, chapter 34, verses 21 to 22. The offering of him that sacrificeth a thing wrongfully gotten is stained, and the mockeries of the unjust are not acceptable. The Lord is only for them that wait upon him in the way of truth and justice. So in other words, God doesn't want your gold if you obtained it unjustly. And reading that, Las Casas decided to devote himself to the rights of the Indians. He freed the slaves he held and began preaching against the mistreatment. He met with resistance and decided the only way he could make a difference was to return to Spain and plead his case before the king. Ferdinand, though, was ailing at the time, and he died in 1516. Charles was a minor at the time, so the kingdom was under the regency of Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros. So while he was waiting for his audience, Las Casas wrote his first work, Memorial de Remedios para las Indias, or Remedies for the New World, in 1516. He presented it to Cardinal Cisneros, who set up a commission of 3 Hieronymite friars to take over the government of the Indies. And Las Casas himself was appointed protector of the Indians, which was basically, we would call that a czar, an Indian czar in today's language. He was an advisor and in charge of that subject. But again, he met with resistance and returned to Spain. Cardinal Cisneros had died, and now Charles had assumed the government himself, and he offered a plan to phase out the encomiendas and replace them with self-governing, tribute-paying townships, and then to import Spanish peasants with land grants to populate the colonies without resorting to populate the colonies with free Spanish subjects. The king supported this, and he received a grant. Las Casas, and interestingly, Columbus's son, Diego, also supported him in this effort. And in 1520, he received a grant to establish his free township. But by 1522, it had failed due to conflicts between the settlers and the natives. And a lot of his critics pointed to this to say, see, these crazy ideas will never work. Just let us do things as we've been doing them. Las Casas took a break. Then in 1523, he took vows as a Dominican friar and spent the next 10 years studying Aquinas. But in 1534, he resumed his work and went as a missionary in Nicaragua and Guatemala, and finally Oaxaca in Mexico. There he engaged in a debate with the Franciscans, whose methodology was just to baptize the natives en masse and send them to work on the encomienda. He took the position that to properly convert a native, one had to approach them as an equal, and number 2, the conversion had to be voluntary and based on an adequate knowledge and understanding of the faith. Prompted by this position, the Pope in 1537 issued the decree, the bull Sublimis Deus. And I'll quote directly from it because it's significant. We who, though unworthy, exercised on earth the power of our Lord and seek with all our might to bring those sheep of his flock who are outside into the fold committed to our charge, consider, however, that the Indians are truly men and that they are not only capable of understanding the Catholic faith, but, according to our information, they desire exceedingly to receive it. Desiring to provide ample remedy for these evils, we define and declare by these our letters that notwithstanding whatever may have been or may be said to the contrary, the said Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or the possession of their property, even though they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ, and that they may and should freely and legitimately enjoy their liberty and the possession of their property, nor should they be in any way enslaved. Should the contrary happen, it shall be null and have no effect. Now, that's an official adoption of Las Casas's position that the Indians were fully capable of grasping and understanding the faith and should be treated as such. And it also provided an official papal sanction to the ban on slavery. And it bolstered Las Casas's case immensely. He established Dominican missions and received royal support in 1540. And then in 1542, he wrote his most famous work, which was published 10 years later as Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, or Brief History of the Destruction of the Indies. It was a summary of the atrocities perpetrated against the Indians. And he wrote it because it was his case that he was presenting before the Royal Council to plead for abolition of the encomienda system. And he was successful. In 1542, Charles I issued Las Leyes Nuevas, or the new laws. It had, I'll go through a few of its provisions here. It reiterated the ban on enslavement, but it specifically stated that it was the obligation of all royal governors to look after the welfare of the Indians, and that there was no motive to enslave Indians in the future, not by war, nor due to rebellion, nor for rescue, nor for any other reasons. Any Indians currently enslaved had to be freed immediately, and then making Indians work against their will or without fair payment had to be ended immediately. Specifically regarding encomienda labor, Indians were required to pay tribute to the encomendero, but if they worked, they had to be paid wages in exchange for their labor. Indians were prohibited from working in the mines unless it was absolutely necessary, and then it had to be under the same working conditions as Spanish workers. Indians were required to be taxed fairly and treated well. That's kind of vague, but it outlined the principle. Only the crown had the right to establish encomiendas. And that prohibition extended not just to private individuals, but also to religious orders, hospitals, and civil servants. Only the crown had that authority. Public officials or clergy with encomienda grants had to return them immediately. Grants given to original conquerors had to be stopped, and then the ones that currently existed after the death of the owner had to return to the crown. This was sweeping, and it effectively put an end to the encomienda system through most of the Spanish colonies. And in fact, in Peru, the reaction was quite hostile. Francisco Pizarro had been assassinated by his enemies, but his brother Gonzalo actually killed the first viceroy that the Spanish crown had sent to enforce the laws. Pizarro then declared Peru independent and suspended the royal laws. So in response, King Charles sent Bishop Pedro de la Gasca to quell the rebellion, and he ended up capturing and executing Pizarro and all the rebel landowners in 1548. Las Casas, in response to his work, was made Bishop of Chiapas in Mexico, which he had for 6 years. And he developed a reputation. He excommunicated anyone who mistreated Indians, refused absolution to slave owners unless they freed their slaves. But still, he felt that the new laws were being ignored. So in 1550, he returned to Spain and engaged in a famous debate, the Valladolid debate of 1551. his opponent was argued in favor of the encomienda system, stating that the opponent took the position that the Indians' practice of cannibalism and human sacrifice rendered violence against them a just war, and therefore enslavement was proper as a consequence of the just war. Las Casas, however, took the position that every individual was obliged to prevent the innocent from being unjustly treated. He cited Saints Augustine and John Chrysostom, who opposed the use of force to bring others to the Christian faith. And he said, yes, human sacrifice was wrong, but it would be better to avoid war and achieve conversion by peaceful means. The judges in this debate reached an inconclusive verdict, but in the end, it was Las Casas's ideas that would prevail. He spent his final years at the College of San Gregorio in Burgos as an academic, but he had huge influence at court on King Philip II, and it was said that he would choose the members of the Council of the Indies. In 1561, he completed his magnum opus, the 3-volume History of the Indies, which he said he didn't want published for 40 years after his death, but it actually would not be fully published until 1875. And in fact, to this day, it still has not been fully translated into English. Also, a briefer version of this history was published 5 years earlier in 1556. It's a modified version it's called an apologetic history of the Indies. In other words, it's done to make an argument. Interestingly, Las Casas took the position that the Indians were just as civilized as the Egyptian, Greek, and Roman civilizations, and he said even more sophisticated than some European societies at the time, which we don't think, it's not a position we think about when we think about the Spanish colonization of the Americas, and we might call it forward-looking for its time. Las Casas died in 1566, and the process for his beatification in the church began in 2002. So the aftermath from Las Casas's work, there's a dramatic decline. The encomienda system effectively ceased to exist. There were other factors in it due to the dramatic decline of the Indian population due to disease, but the encomienda system wasn't officially abolished until 1791. There were a few holdouts in southern Chile, but the system effectively ceased to exist in most of Spanish America by the mid-16th century. In response, there was a dual system. Spanish colonial society was divided into what was called the República de los Indios and the República de los Españoles, or the Indian Republic and the Spanish Republic. In other words, the Indians had their own societies and governing laws, and everyone else, not just Spanish settlers, but mixed race, mestizos, and then Hispanicized Indians as well, were under Spanish law as subjects of the Spanish crown without the being grouped into the Indian societies. The Indians were governed there were two systems. There was the repartimiento, which was similar to the French corvée system, which was a system of tribute labor as a form of taxation. It was owed to the crown, and then the crown could assign it to an official or even a private individual. However, there were restrictions on this as well. Only 7 to 10% of the adult male population was allowed to be assigned at any one time. Wages were paid, and then tribute was taken from the wages. In the north, in what was called New Spain, which is Mexico, Central America, the system fell out of use and was replaced directly by wage labor. Interestingly, in Peru, this system closely resembled what the Incans had used before, the mita tribute system. And because of this, it endured right until the age of the time of independence, just as a customary system. There were also what was called reducciones, or reductions. In the remote areas, Indians were resettled in villages, both to facilitate their conversion and to detribalize them and create a sort of pan-Indian identity. And that had, it was a double-edged sword. It was designed to minimize hostilities between native groups, but it had the other effect of eroding distinct cultures and languages. There was also the system of caciques. It was a characteristic of the Republic of the Indians. The word cacique derived from the Taino word for housekeeper or chieftain. Even though it came from the Caribbean, it began to apply across the Spanish colonies, although in the Andean regions, the word curaca was preferred. What this was the existing chiefs, in return for supporting the Spanish crown and serving as an intermediary between the Spanish and their people, the cacique would be allowed to retain his privileges and indeed be recognized as a European-style nobleman with the right to use don or doña, which is lord and lady in Spanish. As the Indian populations integrated, the roles became less prominent, but the rights and titles remained right until independence. Interestingly, too, the daughters of the Aztec and Inca royalty married into the conquistadors and the Spanish nobility, and there are descendants who are among today's Spanish nobility. The counts of La Conquista and Las Lagunas are descended from the Incan emperors and still exist today. And in fact, one of their descendants is the current Queen of the Netherlands. And then Montezuma's great-grandson was created Count of Moctezuma, which still exists in Spain. In fact, it was elevated to the title of Duke and has grandee privileges, which is the highest privilege of nobility in Spain. So the Indian nobility was very much integrated with the Spanish nobility. So a bit of structure of the Spanish administration. There's a little map of the New World at the height of the Spanish claim. At the very first level was the Council of the Indies, which was based in Seville. It drafted all legislation, advised on all appointments to positions in the New World, and it was the final judicial authority over all cases originating from the Americas and the Philippines. Below that was the Viceroy. The Spanish colonies were divided into two viceroyalities: New Spain, which was pretty much everything in North America except for Panama, and then Peru, which was everything in South America plus Panama. Although Peru would later be split up into three viceroyalities. What the viceroy was the king's personal representative, because the king couldn't be everywhere at once. The viceroy acted and had the same powers as the king in his absence. However, in each viceroyalty, there was also an audiencia, which was a court. It was extremely powerful. Not only did it function as an appellate court in judicial affairs, it oversaw the implementation of laws, and it was a counterweight to the viceroy, with the right to communicate directly with the king and the Council of the Indies. And significantly, the members of the audiencia were called oidores, or hearers. And by the 18th century, nearly half of them had actually been born in the Americas. Um, see a large degree of, self-governance here. Um, on a more local, regional level, rather, there was the corregidor, or corrector, um, who is designed to be a government check on the local landowners, originally to check the encomiendas, but afterwards to check all the local private individuals. Um, in After the House of Bourbon inherited the Spanish throne in 1700, they implemented a series of reforms, which included representing the corregidor with what was called an intendant, which toned down the power a bit. The intendant was a mere fiscal official who was responsible just for tax collection and oversight. And then on a local level, you had what were called the cabildos. These were town councils made up of the landowners. Sometimes they were elected, sometimes they were appointed. They included the councilors, municipal judges, the police chief, the court clerk, and the inspector of supplies, the public herald. These would play an important role in the independence movements, and it was really local self-government. And then on the frontier, you had presidios, which were forts, and missions, which were religious settlements. Also, the church had a unique organization as well. The Vatican, unlike today, did not directly control church affairs. Instead, it was under what was called royal patronage, or patronato real. It had its basis in canon law, which allowed for a layperson to patronize religious institutions. And in the case of the kings of Spain, they were given huge patronage powers that effectively put them in control of the church in the New World. A series of papal bulls under Alexander VI and Julius II gave the kings of Spain the right to send missionaries, the right to collect the tithe, the right to establish and define dioceses, and then to suggest and veto appointments of bishops by the Pope. So they had a huge say in ecclesiastical affairs. On the ground, conversions of the Indians were largely voluntary, and especially in Mexico, where you had poor friars coming and preaching about a God who didn't demand human sacrifice. It attracted a lot of Indians on their own. And in fact, as I discussed earlier, many of the chieftains voluntarily embraced the Catholic Church and ordered their people to convert as well. The Inquisition was established in 1571, but interestingly, natives were excluded from its jurisdiction because they were new converts and not expected to understand religious doctrine fully. And in fact, a bishop was reprimanded in 1639 for executing a native chieftain who apostatized from Christianity. Over the entire 300-year history of the Spanish colonies, only 72 people were executed by the Inquisition, which, 72 too many, we could argue, but I think that compares favorably with the priests who were disemboweled in England during Elizabeth's reign at the same time. And then, of course, there are the Jesuits as well. They were originally established by a Spanish soldier who became a priest with the goal of fighting the spread of Protestantism in Europe. And later they reached the New World with the intention to evangelize the non-Christian peoples there. And they had massive success in the frontier regions, learning the native languages and establishing missions, particularly in Paraguay. However, they had an independence streak. They refused to collect and pay the tithe, and often conflicted with the local bishops. And in fact, in 1655, they managed to have a bishop removed who tried to enforce the tithe against their properties. This recalcitrance continued under the Bourbons, and they saw the Jesuits as a hostile force and as a obstacle to their centralizing policies. So the Bourbons expelled the Jesuits from all the Spanish realms in 1767, which actually predates the papal suppression of the order by 6 years. And what isn't talked about very much is the thriving cultural life in Spanish America. The laws of the Indies that were passed by the council mandated planned cities, and a unique style of architecture developed that combined Spanish and native features. And in fact, in the old colonial towns, you can still see them today. Cordoba in Nicaragua, Guatemala City, all over Mexico, the old city of Cuzco, and then Potosi in Bolivia, and Cochabamba. Those are all, I didn't have time to post pictures of them, but those are all examples. They're famous today for their architecture. Spanish art did the same. They developed a unique style that combined European and native elements. And in fact, on the screen here, you can see on the right, this is a depiction that in that style. It's a Spanish colonial artwork, and it shows the succession of the traditional 13 Inca rulers. And you'll notice about 2/3 of the way down, it transitions right to the kings of Spain, showing that they were successors of the same realm and represented a continuity rather than an interruption. And of course, there was literature. The Spanish Golden Age also had its writers in the New World. Most famous, perhaps, is Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in the 17th century. She was a Hieronymite nun and a famous poet and essayist. And then also there was Alonso de Ercilla, who lived in the previous century. He wrote a famous epic, La Araucana, about the conquest of Chile, largely based on his own experiences there. And then Spanish music too. There were several composers from the New World, mostly liturgical music, but the Spanish cultural life, the New World was just an extension of Spanish cultural life, even though it incorporated a lot of native styles in it. And you had a culture in the colonies that really did not exist in any other European colonies at the same time. It was a unique culture that formed the basis for the modern Latin American culture, a combination of Spanish and native traditions. So with that, I'm going to shift gears now to Britain. And what's called the Black Legend is Spain in the English-speaking world has a reputation of being cruel, tyrannical, backwards. And this is largely the work of propaganda from the Renaissance, particularly the Elizabethan age, where due to religious differences and then military and political rivalry, the English engaged in what can only be called a very successful propaganda war against Spain. And with the success and the spread of the British Empire, that reputation spread as well. So when I refer to the Black Legend, that's what I'm referring to. That's what the Spanish authors call it, the Black Legend. So when Las Casas published his Relación in 1542, which detailed the abuses of the Spanish, it was designed to lead to the promulgation of the laws that ultimately corrected the system. However, when the publication was released, it got into the hands of English translators and Dutch translators who almost immediately used it as anti-Spanish propaganda. There was a work at the time, in 1589, Robert Ashley, an English author, wrote a comparison of the English and Spanish nations. And I'm just going to read some of it in its modern rendition to give you an idea of what English propaganda about Spain was at the time. Thoroughly consider the nature and disposition of the Spaniard, in whom may be seen together incorporated a crafty fox, a ravenous wolf, and a raging tiger, and let that be spoken in respect of the least insupportable of that nation. For he which shall nearly look into those of greatest account among them, that is, such as are more wicked and abominable than the vulgar sort, he shall find every one of them the cube, yea, oftentimes the very source of this ternary monster. He shall find, I say, an unclean and filthy swine, a thievish howlet, a proud peacock, and for an accomplishment of all their ornaments, he shall find a legion of devils, making trade of lying, cozening, and deceiving the world. It is about 100 years since they discovered a new world under the conduct of Christopher Columbus, who in my judgment would never have undertaken this voyage if he had thought that the men whom he brought thither, as they were charmed by the cup of Circe, should straightways be transformed into lions, panthers, tigers, and other savage beasts. And then, O Turks, O Scythians, O Tartarians, rejoice ye now. See thence at this day there is found in Christendom a nation which by their wicked and detestable deeds go about to bury that hatred which is born to your barbarous cruelty. So those are fighting words, and that is fairly typical of what English opinion was of the Spanish at the time. And this hatred was used to justify privateering expeditions against the Spanish, most famously Sir Francis Drake, but also other expeditions, Christopher Newport, the Earl of Cumberland. A big setback to Spain came in the 17th century, though. Based on the Treaty of Tordesillas and the Papal Bull, Spain considered only itself and Portugal the only two nations legally entitled to the Americas. But there was the Anglo-Spanish War of 1654 to 60, and then the war had concluded, but no treaty negotiations had been made. The English had effectively seized Jamaica and part of the coast of Yucatan that would now become Belize. Charles II sent a privateer, Sir Henry Morgan, to sort of persuade the Spanish to come to the negotiating table. And he led a very successful but very bloody expedition against the Spanish settlements along the Caribbean. And then Spain did come to the negotiating table. It was plagued by internal divisions after the death of Philip IV of Spain. His 4-year-old son, Charles II, inherited the throne. This is Charles II, who had been so severely inbred that he was incapable of ruling on his own. So Spain was divided between the various factions at court, and it was not in any position to carry on a war. So they negotiated the Treaty of Madrid in 1670, which forced Spain to recognize Britain's legal presence in the New World. It ceded them Jamaica, and then granted English ships freedom of movement in the Caribbean. This was considered a huge blow, and the Spanish at the time regarded it as a humiliation. During the course of the 18th century, Britain underwent the Industrial Revolution and was looking at new markets for its mass-produced goods. Now, Spain kept a very tight control over its colonies. The colonies were only allowed to conduct trade with Spain and its other possessions, which would have included what is now Belgium and southern Italy at the time. But those were not, they didn't produce enough to satisfy the demand for goods in the New World. And the British recognized that and were looking for inroads to expand their trade into the Spanish colonies. What ultimately gave them that ability was the upheaval caused by the French Revolution and then the succeeding Napoleonic Wars. When the revolution broke out, Spain, under the Bourbons, the cousins of Louis XVI, naturally joined the coalition against the French Republic, but suffered a serious defeat. And at the Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1796, they were forced into an alliance with the French republics. Now, Spain was an unwilling ally, but it was their treaty obligations, and it was mainly to use Spain's navy, which was the only navy in the world that could potentially rival Britain's sea power. That navy, however, was decimated at Trafalgar when the French called upon it to be used. With the Spanish Navy crippled, Britain first began to try a direct invasion of the Spanish colonies. In 1806 and 1807, they attacked Buenos Aires and Montevideo, but they were repulsed by the local militias. So then the British strategy turned to supporting independence movements and allying with them to gain market access that way. Now, the main turn of events occurred in 1808 when Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 directly. He couldn't rely on the unwilling Spanish, so he forced Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII of Spain to abdicate and installed his brother Joseph as king. The Spanish didn't take to this well, and the peninsular, we all hear about Napoleon's invasion of Russia rather, as his downfall. The other strategic mistake he made that really decimated his forces was the Peninsular War in Spain, which was a bloody guerrilla war fought for 6 years against the Spanish resistance. And actually, the British backed the Spanish resistance in Spain, while at the same time they were working against Spain in the New World, which is how they operated. So what happened was with the king with the Spanish monarchy, Bourbon monarchy overthrown, the local governments in Spain set up what were called juntas or councils that attempted to govern the country as loyalists to the House of Bourbon. And then a supreme junta called itself the Regency Council asserted its loyalty to the Bourbons. Now, interestingly, it was liberal and bent and had drafted a constitution for Spain in 1812 that Ferdinand VII would actually refuse to recognize when he was restored 3 years later. Now, in the New World, the same confusion resulted. You had local governments forming their own juntas, but they took various positions on where their loyalty lay. And in fact, the scholastic doctrine of retroversion of sovereignty was cited as the basis for this difference of opinion, which states that when the legitimate ruler is removed or absent for whatever reason, the power reverts to the local level to assert control, because the primary goal is the welfare of the citizen. So the juntas were divided. What were called the royalists were actually those supporters of the Regency Council. Those that were called patriots or rebels actually supported self-governance, but in many respects, in many of them rather, still pledged their loyalty to Ferdinand VII. They just would assume the duties of government at the local level. Eventually, though, many of the juntas, most of them would adopt, there was a liberal fraction that would prevail and ultimately would end up declaring independence. Starting in 1810, there was a series of juntas called Venezuela became the first junta to declare itself independent in 1811. Argentina, or what would become Argentina, the Buenos Aires junta would convene in 1810. The east bank of the Plata River, what is now Uruguay, they supported the Argentine declaration. In Paraguay in 1810 as well. Chile, late in September of 1810. The royalist base at this time was in Peru, out of Lima, where the viceroy had his seat, and they were able to reassert control over Chile and Venezuela several times, and then the juntas received military support, and commanded by men like Simón Bolívar in the north, José de San Martín in the south, and then Bernardo O'Higgins in Chile would ultimately lead the anti-royalist forces. And by 1824, the rebel forces would prevail and ended up taking Peru, which was the last stronghold to fall. There was a slightly different dynamic in the north, in Mexico. In 1810 as well, Father Miguel Hidalgo, in a sermon, issued what was called the Cry of Dolores, which called for the overthrow of the government. But again, he proclaimed his loyalty to Ferdinand VII, and stressed obedience to the religious institutions of the day as well. He was executed in 1811. His successor in the rebellion, Father Morelos, was executed 4 years later, but the rebellion still continued. What finally forced the independence of Mexico was actually events in Spain. Ferdinand VII had been restored in 1815 with the Congress of Vienna, but reverted to an absolutist government as existed before the French invasion. That was Talleyrand's famous remark that the Bourbons had learnt nothing and forgotten nothing. Ferdinand VII was an exemplar of that. But the troops who had been fighting the rebel groups in the New World had returned to Spain, and they had been influenced by the liberal ideas there. And so in 1820, they staged their own coup in Spain, which quite literally kept Ferdinand a prisoner in the royal palace, and they forced him to readopt the 1812 Constitution and began purging the government of Ferdinand's conservative or ultra-royal supporters. That would actually come, it was called the Trienio Liberal, or the liberal triennium, and it would actually come to an end when Louis XVIII of France invaded Spain, put down the rebellion, and restored Ferdinand to his absolutist position. That was actually, it was more of a measure to show the French that they could still win a war after the Napoleonic defeat, with the side effect of helping his Bourbon cousin as well. But during the height of the liberal triennium, the royalist forces in the New World, and especially in Mexico, pretty much gave up. And a royalist colonel, Agustin de Iturbide, defected to the rebels, negotiated a surrender with them, and became constitutional emperor of Mexico in 1821, after exactly 300 years of Spanish rule. Interestingly enough, In 1822, the southern, let me back up there. Augustine's empire extended from Panama to what is now Alaska. But in 1822, the provinces of Central America seceded as a single nation, the United Provinces, and they would dissolve in 1841, forming the 5 nations we know today: Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. And then, of course, there was the Augustine himself would be overthrown in 1823, and a Republican government set up, but it would constantly be plagued by a civil war over whether Mexico would have a federal or a unitary republican system. The settlers in Texas took advantage of the division to declare themselves independent, and that led to the Mexican-American War. That would ultimately lead to loss of half of Mexico's claimed territory, and resulting in the borders we see today. And that left by 1819, and Spain, to fund its war, sold Florida in 1819 to the United States. So after 1824, Spain's empire was left with only Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and then the Philippines, Guam, and then the Mariana and Caroline Islands in the Pacific, which it would hold until 1898. But throughout these rebel movements, the British were intimately involved in it, both covertly and overtly. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, took the official position of neutrality. He would not recognize the new governments, but at the same time, he declined all assistance requested from Spain, even as he was assisting Spain, the Spanish resistance in its fight against the Bonapartist monarchy there. And as you'll see, the refusal to recognize the new governments was a very wily strategy. So before 1817, British involvement was covert. There were individual adventurers who received tacit encouragement from the British government, but nothing official. There was Gregor MacGregor, a Scottish adventurer who actually married Simón Bolívar's cousin and assisted Bolívar in his battles starting in 1811. And then there was Guillermo Brown, the father of the Argentine Navy. He was an Irish-born British subject who had settled in Buenos Aires before the hostilities broke out, but he built the Navy for the new Argentine Confederation, largely from British recruits and using, of course, British seafaring knowledge. And then after 1815, there was a glut of arms. After the cessation of European hostilities in 1815, there was a glut of arms, and private British-controlled arms dealers engaged in a significant amount of arms trafficking from Jamaica and Trinidad with the rebels in Spanish America, and it became quite a lucrative business. Then in 1817, the British government actually began a recruitment effort for forces to assist the rebels against Spain. Number one, this alleviated the burden of having 500,000 unemployed soldiers. And then it also enabled it to sell its warships. It reduced its fleet after 1815, and it sold 250 warships to the insurgent groups. In Bolivar's army, there were actually 2 British and 1 Irish legion, and Bolivar credited them with several of his victories, including Junín and Ayacucho, which were the decisive battles that ended Spanish royal rule in Peru. And then Thomas Cochrane, the Earl of Dundonald, was given command of the rebel Chilean fleet, and he staffed it entirely with British and U.S. officers, and all commands were given in English. And through his efforts, the Chilean rebels captured the fort at Valdivia and then blockaded Peru uh, from Spanish reinforcements to assist the land invasion. So these British efforts were instrumental in the rebel victories against Spanish rule. Spain, in the meantime, protested that this violated Castlereagh's official policy of neutrality. But he consulted the Lord Chancellor at the time, Lord Eldon, who opined that the prohibition on foreign service for British soldiers did not apply to unrecognized states, which the rebel governments were at the time. So technically, British soldiers were not prohibited from embarking on service in South America. You can call that splitting hairs, and it certainly was, but that was the main motivation for the British refusal to recognize the new governments. By 1819, 10,000 British troops were serving in the rebel forces, 6,500 in the army and 3,500 in their navies. After Castlereagh committed suicide in 1822, George Canning became foreign secretary, and his big policy coup was at the Congresses of Aix-la-Chapelle and Verona in 1823, where Britain committed the great Congress powers, which is France, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, to agree not to send any assistance to Spain in the Americas. This effectively left Spain on its own in trying to deal with the rebellions, which it did not have the capability to do, especially after dealing with both the Peninsular War at home and the previous attempts to fight the rebels abroad. And the British knew this and knew that Spain would not have any ability to regain possession of its colonies. At the same time, in the United States, President Monroe, in his State of the Union speech on December 2, 1823, voiced what is we call the Monroe Doctrine, which stated that the U.S. would regard any European power seeking to assert control over the new republics as hostility to the United States and would oppose it. Now, the British under Canning actually supported the Monroe Doctrine because, number one, it expressly excluded all colonies still in possession, which the British colonies all were. And then secondly, the British aim was to take economic advantage, not direct control over the Americas. And in fact, when Britain reasserted direct control over the Falkland Islands in 1833, the US took no position on it. And Argentina especially, but the other new republics, immediately regarded the Monroe Doctrine with suspicion and saw how it could be used as a sword as much as a shield. I also want to talk a little bit now, moving to the Portuguese sphere, about the independence of Brazil. There's a totally different dynamic here. At the same time Napoleon invaded Spain, his forces advanced into Portugal, which was for years had been an ally and indeed a satellite state of the British. The royal family fled Lisbon and settled in Rio de Janeiro. The Queen of Portugal, Maria I, much like George III at the time, was absolutely insane, and she was under the regency of Prince John. Now, when John and the court arrived in Brazil, they found a severely underdeveloped area. The Portugal, number one, had favored its Asian and African colonies, more and kind of neglected Brazil, but also a treaty with the British in 1703 gave favored status to Portuguese wines, but in return, Portugal gave favored status to British manufactured goods. And as a result, there was never any industrial development in Brazil. So the country, when the royal family arrived there, was severely underdeveloped. And John took a liking to it. He enjoyed developing the country, building new cities, building roads, adding infrastructure, and even founding the first university. When the Queen died in 1816, John was crowned as John VI, King of Portugal and Emperor of Brazil, which was a new title he made. And he didn't return to, the Queen's body was shipped back, but the King stayed in Brazil. What finally convinced him to return was there was a liberal uprising in Portugal at the same time as in Spain, and his presence was demanded to negotiate a peace. So he left reluctantly. He left behind his son, Pedro, with the advice, put a crown on your head. And when rebellions against Portuguese rule began to break out, Pedro declared Brazil independent with himself as constitutional emperor. He was forced to return to Portugal in 1831 to become Pedro IV there. And he left his 6-year-old son behind as Pedro II of Brazil, who would rule until 1889. Britain again mediated the Portuguese recognition of independence. Even though Portugal had long been a British satellite state, Britain still supported Brazilian independence because it wanted to take economic advantage of the region. So by 1824, Britain and the United States had recognized all the new republics in the New World, and Britain had achieved its objective. It had duty-free trade over the entire continent, and this led to the expansion of coffee, sugarcane, tobacco, cotton, and rubber, all tropical products with high demand, and British business interests largely controlling the production. In financing, Argentina's first president in 1824 committed the country to a £1 million loan, which was a huge sum at the time, to fund its central bank. And the British firm of the Baring Brothers brokered that loan, and only half of it was furnished in cash. The rest went to the middlemen and speculators who underwrote the loan. This was a huge controversy at the time. It resulted in our President Rivadavia being overthrown 17 months later, and Argentina was committed to loan repayments until 1904, and led to, number one, a large British investment presence in the country, but also a large resentment against British influence, which had its most recent expression in the Falklands War in the 1980s. In Brazil, because of the Portuguese relationship with the African monarchies, Portugal was deeply involved with the Atlantic slave trade to an extent Spain never was. And slavery remained an economically important institution in Brazil, and it wasn't abolished until 1887. However, Brazil, under British influence, officially banned the slave trade in 1826, but it continued covertly. In 1845, Britain passed the Aberdeen Act, which authorized the Royal Navy to intercept any Brazilian ship suspected of being a slave ship. Now, this was a huge affront to Brazilian sovereignty, and the British took full advantage of this to effectively attempt to render Brazil another satellite state, and it almost led to open war in the 1850s. But the Emperor of Brazil was able to negotiate an end to hostilities and effectively end the slave trade in the 1850s. Now, perhaps one of the saddest stories of South America post-independence is what's called the War of the Triple Alliance, or the Paraguayan War. Paraguay was an interesting case. It had always been an extremely isolated region with very little European settlement. And when it declared independence in 1810, it fell under the leader of a former Jesuit seminarian named Gaspar Rodriguez de Francia, who assumed the title of Supreme Director and preferred to be referred to as El Supremo. And he established an iron-fisted dictatorship. He would rule for nearly 30 years until 1840. He was a bad dude. He was the kind of guy who grew an orange tree and would have his political rivals shot under the tree, and he could eat its fruit, which was watered with their blood. His successor as president of Paraguay was Carlos Antonio Lopez. Just, again, another bad dude, a corrupt landowner who used the presidency chiefly to enrich himself. And when he died in 1862, left it to his son, Francisco Solano Lopez. Now, he was another bad dude. He had been sent abroad to Paris to learn culture in his youth and returned with a great admiration for Napoleon, whose nephew was Emperor of France at the time, and fancied himself something of a military dictator, and sought to expand Paraguay, make it a big power in the continent, which it was not in a position to do. You had these series of dictators who were politically repressive, but the one thing they did is keep Paraguay completely independent of any British economic influence. They placed a high tariff and in many cases banned foreign products and foreigners from entry into the country, and maintained a largely self-sufficient economy. And that was not something the British wanted. And in 1864, with the American Civil War going on, the British were looking for a place to expand their cotton industry. And because the younger Lopez in Paraguay was kind of a nut and looking for a war, the British found their perfect opportunity. It actually started downstream in Uruguay, which the two rival political parties had the backing of Argentina and Brazil, and the wars between them were proxy wars between Argentina and Brazil. And Lopez decided he would position Paraguay as the guarantor of Uruguayan independence. And when Argentina put its candidate into the presidency of Uruguay, Lopez declared war, which brought Uruguay and Brazil into the war against Paraguay. And this would be a bloody 6-year guerrilla war. 90% of Paraguay's adult male population would be killed as a result, including Lopez himself. And meanwhile, the Allied forces would suffer anywhere from 50 to 200,000 casualties. The numbers aren't very, very well supported. And it would lead to a mass impoverishment of Paraguay for years. And it saddled Brazil with a massive foreign debt, largely owed to Britain, that financed the war. The heavy debt would lead to the overthrow of the Brazilian emperor in 1889, and the republic that followed him would be massively unstable. They went through, I think, 7 constitutions, 2 authoritarian regimes, 9 different coups d'etat. It was ultimately a tragedy for the whole continent. And that brings us to the United States. I discussed the Mexican War of the 1840s, but the United States began its quest for empire in the late 19th century, most infamously the Spanish-American War, which was one of the earliest media-driven wars. It was stirred up by the Hearst Media Company that built on the stories of the Black Legend to support military action against the remaining Spanish colonies. But there were other motivations, as Theodore Roosevelt wrote, quote, our own direct interests were great because of the Cuban tobacco and sugar, and especially because of Cuba's relation to the projected Isthmian Canal. Spain was weak, and the intervening time between the American independence, the Latin American independence in 1898 was a time of civil war and regime change in Spain. It was in no position to face the US Army. And while the United States masked the war as a crusade for local independence, only Cuba was given independence in 1903. The United States held on to the Philippines until 1948, and it still retains Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, and the Mariana Islands to this day. And in fact, Mark Twain was even though the war received widespread support because of the media influence, it did have significant opposition. Mark Twain notably opposed the war in his short story, The War Prayer. And then there was the Panama Canal itself. Now, the idea, since Columbus discovered the New World, any traveler wishing to arrive to the west coast of either continent had to round Cape Horn at the southern point of South America. Now, the waters in Cape Horn are notoriously treacherous. Shipwrecks were common there. And in fact, if you rounded the Cape successfully, it was considered a mark of bravery. So plans to build a canal to circumvent the hazardous Cape Horn voyage predate the Panama Canal by decades. The original plan was to build a canal across the lakes Nicaragua and Managua in Nicaragua. And Cornelius Vanderbilt had plans to finance the canal. And he backed what was called a filibuster, essentially a privateer, named William Walker, who assembled an army of both American adventurers and political enemies of the existing Nicaraguan government, and he overthrew the government and became president of Nicaragua in 1856. But resistance was significant, and Walker ended up being executed, and Vanderbilt abandoned the plan. So the plan resurfaced to go through Panama instead. At the time, Panama was part of the Republic of Colombia, and the French had started the canal but abandoned the project when costs ran too high. The US wanted to take over the project, but the Colombian government was skeptical based on the French failure and not willing to deal with them. So the US backed a separatist movement that declared independence in 1903. They took advantage of a civil war in Colombia at the time, and then the new Panamanian government granted the US the canal zone, which wasn't turned over till Panama until 1979. These are just a few significant examples. There were many more rather, incidents of US involvement in Latin American politics. I'll mention significantly the popularity of bananas in the 1920s led to fruit companies, United States-based fruit companies, and British-based too, Fifes. In the US, you had Dole, um, the United Fruit Company. They wielded significant power and effected regime change in Central American countries. That's the origin of the term banana republic. Well, it's made as a disparaging term to stability of the local governments, but in actuality, it was United States private companies affecting that instability and regime change in those governments. And then during the Cold War, of course, Latin America became a scene of proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union, with the Soviets backing communist rebel movements and the United States backing military regimes. Um, and I should say the United States and Britain. Britain played a significant role, has continued to play a significant role. You had the overthrow of the communist-backed Allende regime in Chile in 1973. You had the Argentine and Brazilian coups through the 70s and the 80s. You had the United States and British-backed Peruvian government of Fujimori and the against the communist-backed, Soviet-backed communist rebels. You had the civil wars in Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, which were all bloody affairs. Those were all proxy wars between the Soviet Union and the NATO powers, as much as Vietnam and Southeast Asia were. One final word, I just want to return to the treatment of the Indian communities. With the independence of the republics, the Indians lost their special separate Republic of the Indians. They were officially citizens just like anyone else, but they lost their caciques and their traditional special protections they had under the Spanish. And in fact, harsh treatment of the Indians resumed after independence. Just a few incidents here. In 1831, the Uruguayan massacred the Charrua Indians, who were declared extinct. In fact, the population of Uruguay is almost totally European to this day. In Chile, the Mapuche Indians of the South had long been independent, even under Spanish rule. The government asserted its control. Actually, a French adventurer attempted to found a separate nation, which he called himself King of Araucania and Patagonia. When he did this, the Chilean government felt the need to integrate the region fully and led a series of wars. Some claim that up to 95% of the Mapuche population died as a result of that. In the 1870s, there was the Argentine conquest of the desert, the expansion of the European population into Patagonia, and the Chilean gold rush in Tierra del Fuego at the same time. Both the Argentine and the Chilean governments paid bounties for dead Indians up through the 1890s. And the bounty was paid upon the presentation of a trophy, which could take the form of a dead Indian's hands, ears, or most commonly testicles. In Mexico, the government paid bounties for Apache scalps starting in 1837. If you've read the novel Blood Meridian, that's based on a true story. I recommend reading it. It's one of the few novels I couldn't put down. It's by what's his name? Cormac McCarthy. It's not for the weak of stomach, though. It describes in gory detail violence perpetrated by both the Indians and the Americans, but it's based on a true story of American privateers pressed into service by the Mexican state government of Chihuahua to collect bounties on Apache scalps. And from what I understand, it's an accurate portrayal of the type of brutality regularly involved in those operations. Also, there's the Yaqui tribe of Sonora, which is the Mexican state south of Arizona. They had long been independent, and they resisted taxation from the Mexican government. So from between the 1860s and 1890s, the Mexican government literally enslaved the Yaquis for non-payment of taxes and shipped them to the southern provinces of states rather, of Chiapas and the Yucatan, where most of them died. The Yaqui population fell from 30,000 to 7,000 over the course of that operation. And then there was the Mayan uprising in the Yucatan, the caste war. Again, a rebellion against the central Mexican government. That war left 300,000 dead over the course of its, it was a 54-year-long war between the Mayan separatist movement and the Mexican government. So I know I gave you a long and detailed presentation, but my goal was to present to you the history of the Spanish conquest, to show that Spanish rule was, to refute the black legend of Spanish rule as cruel and oppressive, and to show that the British involvement in the independence movement were not necessarily a step forward, and that where we are today is not necessarily, in Latin America, so to speak, is not necessarily a good place or, moving forward. So I apologize for taking such a long time, but I would be happy to entertain any questions you have.
Adam, that was exactly that wasn't just what I wanted. That was so much more. This is a reference video that I'm going to be personally rewatching extensively. I didn't expect such a comprehensive, hyper contextualized, which is wonderful, approach to this that brought together so many moving parts. Because frankly, just speaking for myself, the idea of South American, Latin American history and politics has been a big blind spot for me. It's difficult to approach, and it's like trying to figure out how a car works by ignoring the wheels. And so this is a wonderful, wonderful introduction for everybody to get that big brushstroke thumbnail sketch with a lot more detail than I expected. We don't have too much time for too many questions, but I did see that Stephen slipped in his name for a question with two parts, and we might have time maybe for one more question after that. So Stephen.
Adam, thanks very much. Fantastic lecture. Really enjoyed it. I guess my two parts go to the beginning and towards the end of your lecture. Towards the beginning, when you mentioned the explorers, I had the privilege of giving a lecture on Charles Hapgood's Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings about a year ago. Are you aware of the existence of all these ancient maps that go back into high antiquity that show North and South America?
Map.
Yeah, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I used to do a lot of reading about Atlantis and subjects like that, so I do have some familiarity with them.
Okay, I was just wondering if that influenced your interpretation at all into the early motivations for the exploration of the New World.
I knew about it, and it didn't influence my presentation because I do think the main motivation was economic. However, I found it interesting the statement that the Portuguese likely knew of the existence of Brazil before the first navigators arrived there. I wasn't clear on where that knowledge would have come from, and my thought initially did turn to those ancient maps.
Okay, thanks. Now, if I can go for part two and go to towards the end, you mentioned, is it Tierra del Fuego? Or,
Tierra del Fuego, yeah, that's...
Are you familiar with, I guess, somewhat recent article showing that Israel has a large military presence there, supposedly as a vacation spot. And I'm just wondering if with your background, having researched this, if you understand why that might be true. I mean, what would interest Israel in there?
You're familiar with where Tierra del Fuego is, right?
Yeah, right at the southern tip.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a place I would go on vacation, and unless I were, more of the adventurous type.
Yeah.
It doesn't surprise me at all. And I'll just add on a personal note, my wife is a native of Argentina, and I talk to people down there, and there is a widespread awareness of covert involvement by the Israelis. In this country, we might call them conspiracy theories, but it's really a wide, sort of common knowledge down there.
Because when I think of that, I think of Britain and the Falklands, and for some reason, there seems to be a passionate need for presence in the southern part of South America. And of course, I know Matt's promised to do a lecture on Antarctica at some point. I'm wondering if there's any potential relationship there or not.
Well, that has always been a strategic location, again, because of Cape Horn, that controlled access between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And even after the Panama Canal, it still is the only alternate route to allow access. So over the years, not just the Spanish, but the Dutch, the British, all held a significant interest in controlling the Cape.
Okay, so that's explained by basic economics and sea lines of communication versus any other
geography,
more esoteric interpretation. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the one little question that popped up in my mind was that you referenced the circumference of the Earth having been known long before Columbus due to the experiments of Eratosthenes. Mm-hmm. Would Columbus or other explorers have had such knowledge of the circumference of the Earth by the 15th century, or would that have been lost?
Oh no, he absolutely did, and so this kind of dovetails into my last presentation about the history of Spain. Just to put a little plug in there, the libraries at Cordoba. When the Muslim emirs at Cordoba sought to create a cultural center to rival their opponents in Baghdad, so they copied and imported a lot of classical works from both Constantinople and Baghdad. When Cordoba fell to the reconquering Spanish in 1243 thereabouts, the libraries were the king at the time was called Alfonso the Tenth, who was called the Wise, and he immediately ordered copying of all the works in the library at Cordoba and dispersed them throughout Europe. And in fact, that's when the works of Aristotle reached Paris and became influential in European culture at that point. But among the works that were obtained were geographic works. In fact, the Arab navigators in the Indian Ocean and along Africa relied on the works of Ptolemy for their navigation, and those were some of the works that were copied in Cordoba and dispersed, upon the conquest of Cordoba in the 13th century.
Okay, interesting. Because I guess the thought popped up is that people often say that Columbus was surprised that the world was as wide as it is, but I guess that might be just spin and slander. The other question, though, was like, how would he not have realized that this was not India right away?
Because there was no accurate way to measure longitude at the time. I don't know if you've read about the difficulties that navigators had in establishing a system to determine longitude. That was a problem that wasn't solved until the 18th century.
Right.
So, latitude's easy. You just, calculate, find the North Star and measure the angle of it. Longitude always presented a problem. So, and then there was confusion, like I said, over how far the Asian mainland extended east. that Columbus thought it was based on Ptolemy, that it was 30 degrees of longitude further than it actually was. I mean, that would bring you still probably into, not quite to where the New World actually was, but without a way to measure where you were in longitude. I can kind of see why Columbus could think he was in Asia.
Right. Okay. Oh, we've hit the 4:30 mark here in Montreal, and unfortunately, this means that we have to wrap it up for today. Adam, thank you immensely for having gone through this with all of us, and
Well,
this will
thank
be
you
up
for the
available.
invitation.
Oh, well, hopefully we'll. This is just one of many more to come. And
Okay.
if there's any supplementary literature you would like me to link to when we make this available online, send it my way, and that'll be done. I know that you referenced quite a few things in the course of your presentation that seemed interesting. I'll just throw out too, one thing people might enjoy is a film called Quemada by Hilo Pontecorvo, which is a wonderful 1969 film featuring Marlon Brando playing the role of Sir William Walker.
Oh.
And it's really, it actually embodies some principles of classical tragedy quite well.
There's an American film with Ed Harris as William Walker too. I can't remember the name of it. From the 80s, I think.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Adam. Till next time.
Bye.